Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for joining in. I started the live stream here, so about to get started. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, verily our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leads astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone in a partnership that never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good evening. And thank you for joining us again for another Sunday discussion of continuing of the book and the reading of When the Moon Split, which is a biography of the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, filed by Safiur, Rahman, Mubarakpuri. Last week we had finished what we had the week previously finished regarding the Battle of Uhud, which led into now leading up into complex resolutions, and basically now which is going to be the buildup and leading into the topic of the Battle of the Trench. Alhamdulillah. So starting here on page 183, we'll go ahead and continue with that, inshallah. And we'll read until the battle of, we're going to try to read until the battle of the end of the Battle of the Trench until page 200, inshallah, is my goal for today, inshallah. So let's go ahead and jump right to it. So Battle of the Trench. So after the expedition against Banu Nadir and the meek departure of the Quraysh from Badr, a year and a half went by without any disturbances. And it seemed like the Muslims were finally free to spread their religion and bring about changes in their environment and daily lives, but the ideal was soon to be disrupted. The exiled Jewish tribes had consolidated their base at Khaybar, and having done so, they began a dream of vengeance, to dream of vengeance, and realizing the need to rally as much manpower as possible, they went about seeking allies against the Muslims. And some biographers say that 20 chieftains and leaders of the Khaybar Jews went to the Quraysh pledging support for a renewed military campaign. And when the Quraysh agreed, the Jewish delegation contacted Banu Ghaftan, uh, uh, Ghaffran, and they had also gave their consent. And more clans were roped in, and the plan was that each of them should move towards Medina simultaneously. So the digging of the trench. When the news of the coalition reached Medina, the Prophet ﷺ conferred with his companions as to strategy. And the Muslims being so heavily outnumbered, it was imperative that they come up with an impenetrable defense. And Salman al-Farsi, he was a Persian who migrated there, advised that the Muslims should dig a trench to keep the enemy away, and everyone approved of this suggestion. This was actually an old Persian technique that he learned, and from his experiences, he shared that. So Medina was naturally fortified on three fronts, with volcanic plains and granite hills to the east, west, and south. The city was exposed only on the north, and from where the enemy forces could launch an assault. Therefore, the Prophet ﷺ chose to fortify that front, and he marked the narrowest spot stretching between the east and west and covering a distance of about 1 mile, and both belts were connected at this spot by the trench. You know, now that I'm thinking about it, it'd be really good if we could have gotten a map for this, inshallah. But subhanallah, hindsight's 2020. But in the west, the trench began from the north, from the Salah Hills, and joined the end of the easterly belt of Shahayim. And the Prophet ﷺ divided his men into units of 10, with each unit responsible for digging 40 cubits. And he himself participated in the task of digging the trench and carrying loads of earth. And it was a massive undertaking, and the Muslims worked steadily. The morale soared as they relied on their faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the devotion to his Prophet sallallahu for more sustenance, and the companions sang praises of Allah, and the Prophet sallallahu joined in. And when the Prophet sallallahu sang, the companions responded. They bore with quiet heroism the rigorous hardships before them, particularly the biting cold and gnawing hunger, and a handful of barley was procured and cooked in rancid foul-smelling fat. Swallowing the food was a challenge in of itself. And once the men went to the Prophet ﷺ complaining of debilitating hunger, and as proof, each showed him a slab of stone tied to their bellies to stave off the hunger pangs. And the Prophet ﷺ lifted his shirt, tied to his abdomen were two slabs of stone. So the pagans had clamored for miracles to confirm the divine nature of the Prophet ﷺ's message. Allah had sent them signs as they ignored. And during the excavation of the trench, Allah SWT sent the Muslims several signs of His grace, signs that had increased their faith and sustained them through adversity. So on one occasion, Jabir bin Abdullah could not bear to see the Prophet ﷺ assailed by the severe hunger. He slaughtered an ewe and his wife ground for him 2.5 kilograms of barley, and then went to the Prophet ﷺ and discreetly invited him and a few of the Prophet ﷺ's companions. And the Prophet ﷺ accepted the invitation, but brought everyone along, all 1,000 of them. And everyone ate until they were full, but the pot remained replete, and the bread continued to bake unchecked. And similarly, once the sister of Nu'man bin Bashir took a handful of dates for her father and maternal uncle, and the Prophet ﷺ took the dates and scattered them in a cloth. He then called all of the men as they worked away at the trench, and each of them ate to his fill and left, but the dates kept multiplying and could barely be contained within the cloth. And the soil the men encountered was rocky and obdurate. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, Jabir and his men struck a particularly rocky patch that failed all of their efforts, and the Prophet ﷺ, the problem was brought to the notice of the Prophet ﷺ, and he struck it with his pick, and it crumbled into a mound of pliant sand. And other obstacles became oracles with Allah SWT grace. Bara and his unit came across a large rock, and the Prophet ﷺ knelt and said Bismillah before he used his pick. And a piece of the rock came loose, and with the light emerging from it, the Prophet ﷺ said, Allahu Akbar. The keys of Syria have been given to me, and right now I see its red castle. And the Prophet ﷺ struck a second blow with his pick and received tidings of imminent victory over Persia. And the last blow signified the conquest of Yemen. And in this way, the entire rock was demolished, and each blow bringing the Muslims hope. So across the trench now. So while the Muslims concentrated on defense, the Quraysh and their followers arrived with an army of 4,000 men, 300 horses, and 1,000 camels. And Abu Sufyan rode proudly as the commander-in-chief of the allied forces, and their shared bearer was Uthman bin Talha Abdari. They camped at a spot between Jarf and Zagaba, and opening another front, Banu Ghafan, subhanAllah, Rafan, and their 6,000 followers, the men of Najd, pitched camp at the end of the Nakmi Valley in the foothills of Mount Uhud, and the arrival of the two large armies were so close to the walls of Medina, they posed an enormous threat to the Muslims. And Allah SWT mentions the mammoth military coalition in Surah Al-Adhab, Surah 33, ayat 10 and 11. Allah SWT mentions in the English translation, Bismillah, behold, they marched upon you from above and below, and then your eyes spun around and your hearts leapt to your throats. You began to doubt Allah's plan, yet in this was a trial for the believers and an immense jolt. But Allah SWT kept the believers firm on that occasion, continuing in that same surah, ayat 22. When the believers saw the Confederate forces, they said, this is what Allah and His Messenger promised us, and Allah and His Messenger have told us the truth, and only increased their faith and their submission to Allah. And however, the hypocrites among the Muslims were fearful and querulous, and they said, same surah, ayat 12, Allah and His Messenger have promised us nothing but delusions. So once again, the Prophet ﷺ appointed Ibn Maktoum caretaker of Medina, and sent the women and children to take shelter in the forts. And he sent out with 3,000 men and fortified his troops, keeping their backs to Mount Sal'ah. And in front was the trench that stood between the Muslims and the unbelievers. And the pagans arrogantly advanced towards Medina and the Muslims, and as they approached, they caught sight of the trench and stopped in confusion. A novel device, a wily ruse, Abu Sufyan exclaimed in amazement. This trick is totally unknown to the Arabs. Overwhelmed with fury, the pagans set about trying to find a point where they could cross the trench, but the Muslim archers kept them at bay. And a hail of arrows showered the pagans so that they could neither leap across the trench nor fill it with earth. And the Quraysh had no alternative way to lay siege to Medina. Every morning they came out and attempted to cross the trench while the Muslims guarded each inch of the border and greeted them with arrows and stones. And the polytheists made several fruitless attempts to cross the trench and spent days huddled together trying to devise ways to launch their assault. And the Muslims, for their part, were equally determined to make them give up. So, intent where they were protecting their lives, that the Prophet ﷺ and his companions missed several prayers and offered them late around or after sunset. For at that point, the prayer in times of fear, Salah al-Khawf, had not been ordained upon the Muslims. So finally, one day, a party of the pagan cavalry comprising Amr bin Abdul Wud, Ikrama bin Abi Jahl, Darar bin Khattab, and a few other managed to vault over the trench at a narrow spot while their horses pranced around between the trench and Mount Salah. And from another side, Ali sprang forth along with a few Muslims, and by capturing the point of entry, they cut off the pagans' route to escape. So Amr bin Abdul Wud, a ruthless and fearsome warrior, challenged Ali to combat. So Ali provoked Amr's anger with his taunts, and he alighted from his horse. And the two adversaries fought and jostled, thrust and parried, but ultimately Ali put Amr to the sword. And the rest of the polytheists darted back to their horses. They were so disconcerted that Ikrama left his lance trying to flee, and Nawafal bin Abdullah fell into the trench and was put to death by the Muslims. And at the end of the skirmish, 10 pagans and 6 Muslims lay dead. And an arrow hit Sa'ad bin Muadda, and his jugular vein was severed, but miraculously he survived his injury, and he prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to preserve his life only if the decisive battle against the Quraysh was yet to be fought. And his other supplication was to stay alive to see the destruction of Banu Qurayda, and as we shall see, his prayer was answered. So Banu Qurayda's treachery. So after the Battle of Uhud, the Jewish tribe of Banu Qurayda had entered into a pact with the Prophet ﷺ, but in the midst of the Battle of the Trench, Huyay bin Akhtab, the chieftain of Banu Nadir, met Ka'ab bin Asad, the chieftain of Banu Qurayda, and got him to renegade on that agreement, to go back on that agreement. But after some initial hesitation, Ka'ab broke the covenant and sided with the Quraysh and with the pagans. So the stronghold of Banu Qurayda lay to the south of Medina, which was where the Muslims had their fortifications and where they had left their children and their women, and while the men were massed along the north. And with the breach of faith by Banu Qurayda, the Muslim women and children were imperiled. And the Prophet ﷺ rushed Muslim bin Aslam to the head of 200 men and Zayd bin Haritha with another 300 men to protect the Muslim women and the children. And more so over Sa'ad bin Mu'adha and Sa'ad bin Ubaidah were sent behind them to investigate the matter. So the Prophet ﷺ envoys found the Jews openly antagonistic, and Banu Qurayda disparaged the Prophet ﷺ, saying, "Who is the Prophet of God? We have not entered any pact with Muhammad." And the two emissaries reported the situation to the Prophet in just 3 words, Adal and Qara, indicating that the treachery of the Adal and Qara tribes of Raji'i had been repeated by Banu Qurayda. And the Muslims were distressed about their newfound vulnerability, for on this occasion too, the hypocrites bared their fangs. Some of them bemoaned, "Muhammad gave us his word that we would possess the treasure of Caesar," and I'm not sure who this Chosroe. And here we are in such a plight we feel unsafe even to answer the call of nature. And others among them few, the promise made to us by Allah and his messenger was nothing but delusion. And some jeered at the Muslims, "O many of Yathrib, you cannot stand the onslaught, go back." And another group of hypocrites, after deciding to flee the spot, came to the Prophet ﷺ seeking permission to go back, pleading that their houses were unprotected. And when the news of Banu Qurayda's treachery reached the Prophet ﷺ, he covered his face and head with a piece of cloth and lay flat on his back for a while, quietly in perspective. And when he arose, however, it was to give the Muslims good tidings. And although he had taken the step to sending the two companies under Zayd and Muslima to protect the women and the children, the Prophet ﷺ contemplated sending a message to Uyayna bin Hisn to renew their old agreement, and he was willing to cede 1/3 of the fruits of Medina if they would retreat with Banu Ghatfan. And Sa'ad bin Muadda and Sa'ad bin Ubaidah, the two chieftains of the Ansar, voiced their opposition to any negotiations with their allied turned enemy, saying, when both they and we were polytheists, they dared not expect even a grain. And today, when Allah has given us Islam and conferred honor upon us through you, are we expected to give them our goods? By Allah, we shall offer them our swords alone. And the Prophet ﷺ found their argument reasonable and dropped the idea of sending the offer. So the coalition splits and the battle then ends. So at this point, when war seemed imminent, Nu'aym bin Mas'ud Ash'aja'i came to the Prophet ﷺ. He belonged to the Ghatfan tribe and had strong ties with both the Quraysh and the Jews. He confided, O Messenger of Allah, I have embraced Islam and my people are still unaware of my faith. What is your command? And the Prophet ﷺ said, you are alone. What can you do? However, try to split them if you can, for war is nothing but strategy. And Nuaym accordingly went off to Banu Qurayda, who received him with honor. He said to them, you know very well my regard for you. Now I'm to tell you something which you must keep secret. Intrigued, they agreed. Nuaym then said, you all know very well what happened to Banu Qainuqa and Banu Nadir. Now that you have lent your support to the Quraysh and Ghatfan, but their situation is quite different from yours. This is your territory wherein are your women, children, wealth, and property. You cannot go anywhere else while your allies' territory, wealth, and property and households lie far off. Only if they find an opportunity will they act. Otherwise, they will leave for their own havens, leaving you at the mercy of Muhammad, and he will take revenge at will. So after having sown the seeds of disquiet, Nuaym left to meet with the Quraysh. Then, addressing all the chieftains collectively, he began and said, you know, I am a great well-wisher of you all. They all forced his assent. Nuaym continued, now I shall tell you something, but you must keep it secret. And we will do as you say, they replied in one voice. And Nuaym said, the Jews regret the breach of trust they have committed. They fear that you will go back, leaving them at Muhammad's mercy. To appease Muhammad, they have offered to hand you over to him as hostages. Stay alert and do not yield anyone hostages if they should ask you to do so. And then Nuaym called on the Ghatfan with the same ploy. His stratagem succeeded in creating a mutual suspicion among the allies, and when Abu Sufyan sent a message to Banu Qurayda to launch a joint attack the following day, he got a cold response. And the Qurayda answered, it is Saturday and we cannot fight. Calamities have befallen us because we broke the rules of the Sabbath. And secondly, we refuse to fight along with you unless you send us hostages. You must leave for your destinations and leave us defenseless. And at this, the Quraysh and the Ghatfan said, by God, Nuaym was right. And the Quraysh sent a message to the Qurayda informing them that they would not send any hostages and insisted on setting out for battle. And at this rejoinder, Banu Qurayda said Nuaym had spoken the truth and the alliance was thus shattered. So meanwhile, the Muslims spent this period of impending danger in supplication. O Allah, shelter us and preserve us from all of the dangers. And the Prophet ﷺ invoked his Lord, O Allah, sender of the book and the speediest in taking account, vanquish the enemy. O Allah, give them a tremendous jolt. So in answer to the Muslims' prayer, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down a violent storm and an army of angels against the enemy forces, and their utensils were overturned and their tents uprooted. And all of their belongings were strewn across the camp, and the freezing cold also shook their resolve. So disheartened and dejected, they prepared to withdraw. So that night, the Prophet ﷺ sent Hudayfa to gather information, and Hudayfa went down into the enemy front and came back unaffected by the storm or the cold. And as news about the retreating enemy relieved the Muslims, and they all went to sleep. And the next morning, they found the battlefield deserted. So the enemy forces had assembled in Shawwal, the fifth of after the year of Hijrah, and for one long month, the Muslims had lived under the threat of a massive attack on all fronts. And it was in Dhul al-Qada that the enemy coalition had finally dispersed. And it had been the biggest ever attempt to capture Medina and annihilate the Muslims, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had confounded their machinations. And with the failure of such hardy warriors as the Quraysh and Banu Khatfan, quite naturally, the smaller enemy tribes took heed. They did not dare take on the Muslims, and Medina was safe at last. And the Prophet ﷺ declared to his men, "Now we shall strike them, and they will not attack us. Our army will march upon them from now on." So next we get to the Battle of Banu Qurayza. So on his return from the Battle of the Trench, as the Prophet ﷺ prepared to take a bath in the apartment of Salama, Jibril came to him, and he informed the Prophet ﷺ that he and the other angels were being sent to terrify Banu Qurayza and inflict havoc on their fortresses. So following Jibril's news, the Prophet ﷺ sent out an announcement so that everyone who followed him was to perform the Asr prayer at Banu Qurayza, and it was time for the Muslims to witness an act of divine intervention and to draw comfort from it. The Prophet ﷺ entrusted the affairs of the state to Ibn Maktoum and sent out an advance party under Ali, and Banu Qurayza spotted the approaching Muslims and began hurling abuses at the Prophet ﷺ. And the rest of the Muslims also made quick preparation to join the vanguard, but were delayed in the advent of Asr. They halted for the prayer and were late in reaching Banu Qurayza, and the Prophet ﷺ set out accompanied by the Muhajirin and the Ansar and halted at Anna, a famous well of Banu Qurayza. And as it happened, even before the Muslim forces got there, Allah cast terror into the hearts of Banu Qurayza. They shut themselves in their castle, too terrified to confront the Muslim warriors, who arrived then to lay siege. And the Jews sent word to the Prophet ﷺ that they wished to consult with Abu Lababa, who was then sent there as chief negotiator. And seeing him approach, the men rushed towards him with their women and children, while their women and children began to weep bitterly. And their tears and lamentations moved Abu Lababa deeply, and they said to him, "Do you think it is desirable that we submit to Muhammad?" "Yes," replied Abu Lababa, and then he pointed to his throat, indicating that all of them would be put to death. And instantly it occurred to him that he had betrayed Allah and his messenger by giving the enemy information through his gesture. And he hastened back. He went straight to the Prophet ﷺ's mosque and tied himself to one of the pillars, vowing that the Prophet ﷺ alone would unfasten him. And when the Prophet ﷺ heard about Abu Lababa, what he had done, he remarked, "Had he come to me, I would have invoked Allah's forgiveness upon him. Since he has imprisoned himself of his own volition, I will leave him in the same state until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Almighty decides his fate." And the long siege disheartened Banu Qurayza. 25 days had passed, and they finally surrendered to the Prophet ﷺ. And he imprisoned the men and kept the women separate, and the people of Aus asked him to show mercy to their old allies, just as he had done with Banu Qaynuqa. And wisely, the Prophet ﷺ avoided putting himself in the position of sole arbiter of the captive fates. He asked the people of Aus, "Would you let an arbiter from amongst you decide?" And they nodded, and to the pleasure the Prophet ﷺ appointed their chief, Sa'ad bin Mu'adha, as judge. And the wound Sa'ad had received in the Battle of the Trench had left him confined to Medina. He was summoned to the Muslim camp, and as he rode up, the Prophet ﷺ said to the people, "Rise up to help him." And obediently the people rose and advanced to help Sa'ad. They milled around him, clamoring, "Sa'ad, treat your allies kindly." But Sa'ad did not reply. And when the people grew insistent with their pleas, he said, "This is the time when Sa'ad cares least about the reproaches of those who reproach Allah Almighty." So Sa'ad's words were an empathetic rejection of the people's request. They knew that no leniency was to be expected, and some people returned to Medina and announced the demise of the captives. And when Sa'ad dismounted, he was told that Banu Qurayza had declared their willingness to accept his verdict. He pronounced his judgment. The men were to be killed, the women and children to be taken captive, and the property to be divided amongst the Muslim community. And the Prophet ﷺ remarked that the judgment you have passed on them was passed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Almighty in the seven heavens. This judgment is also in accordance with the law of the Jews. In fact, it shows more compassion than is found in Jewish law. And following Sa'ad's decision, Banu Qurayza were brought to Medina. They were confined in the house of a woman of Banu Najjar, the daughter of Harith, and pits were dug in the marketplace of Medina, and the prisoners were brought in groups and beheaded in the pits. And some sources put their number in 400, while others place it between 600 to 700. And only one woman was put to death, and she was thrown. She had thrown a hand mill at Khalid bin Zuwayd and killed him. And along with them, Hayy bin Akhtab, the chieftain of Banu Nadir, was also killed, and he was one of these 20 chieftains of the Jews who had orchestrated the alliance between the Quraysh and Banu Ghatfan. And he it was who had swayed Banu Qurayza to break their pact with the Muslim, pledging them his support and saying he was ready to share their fate. And he remained with them during the siege and their subsequent surrender, and was finally put to death them. So some individual of Banu Qurayza had embraced Islam before the surrender and thus escaped the punishment. The booty amounted to 1,500 swords, 300 coats of mail, 2,000 lances, 500 shields, and a large number of goods, vessels, and livestock. And the Prophet ﷺ then kept 1/5 of the date palms in the captives, and he divided the rest of the booty amongst the soldiers. The foot soldiers got 1 part, and the cavaliers received 3 parts of the whole, 1 portion for the soldier and 2 for his horse. And the prisoners were sent to Najd and arms brought in lieu of them. However, the Prophet ﷺ chose Raina bin Zayd bin Amr bin Hanafa for himself, and it was said that he married her after setting her free, and she died after the Prophet ﷺ's farewell Hajj. And when the Muslims did away with Banu Qurayza, the prayer of Sa'ad bin Mu'adha, the righteous servant of Allah, was answered. He lay in a tent by the Prophet ﷺ's mosque so that the Prophet ﷺ could visit him and inquire about his health. And one day, a she-goat leaped on him and caused his wound to bleed again. Sa'ad succumbed to his injury, and it is said that angels lifted his coffin. And Abu Lubaba, who had imprisoned himself in the Prophet's mosque for his hint to Banu Qurayza about their fate, had spent 6 nights tied to a pillar. His wife would unfasten him at prayer time, and afterwards he would again be tied to that pillar. And then a verse regarding Abu Lubaba's was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ while he was at Salama's house. Allah revealed that he had forgiven Abu Lubaba, and people rushed to Abu Lubaba with the good news and tried to untie him, but he refused to be unbound, saying that none but the Prophet ﷺ would do it. And the Prophet ﷺ unfastened him when he came out to offer Fajr prayers, and events came then to a close. And after the Battle of Banu Qurayza, the Prophet ﷺ led a number of expeditions to consolidate the peace that he had won. Some of his important military excursions are described in this section here. Abu Rafi Salam bin Abdul Qayyuk is killed. So Abu Rafi was a wealthy Jewish merchant from Hijaz who had settled in Khaybar, and he was instrumental in organizing the coalition against the Muslims. And once the threat of the coalition receded and Banu Qurayza were put to the sword, it was decided that Abu Rafi was too dangerous to be left unchecked. So the Muslims from the Aus tribe had killed Ka'ab bin Ashraf and eliminated a major threat against the Muslims. So their success had brought them acclaim from the community. Now the Khawarij tribe wanted the assignment to silence Abu Rafi, and 5 men from among them rose to carry out the mission in Dhul Hijjah, the 5th year after the Hijrah. Abu Rafi's fortress lay in the outskirts of Khaybar, and the Khawarij men under Abdullah bin Atiq reached there at sunset, and Abdullah asked his men to wait nearby and went off by himself to the fortress gate. He squatted there casually as if he were one of the inhabitants, and the watchman saw him and said, "O servants of God, please come back in. I need to close the gate." So Abdullah needed no second invitation. He complied, and as soon as he entered, he hid himself. And late that night, he stole the keys and opened the gate to facilitate his escape. Then he headed for Abu Rafi's room. He took the precaution of locking from inside every door that he opened, and the darkness of the chamber and the slumber of its inhabitants gave no clue about Abu Rafi's whereabouts. Abu Rafi, Abdullah called out softly, "Who is there?" Abu Rafi asked, Abdullah followed the voice and struck Abu Rafi with his sword, managing to injure but not kill him, and Abu Rafi screamed in pain. Unfazed, Abdullah left the room only to re-enter pretending to be one of the household. Disguising his voice, he came up and inquired, Abu Rafi, what was that noise? May your mother be destroyed. Someone just struck me with a sword, and Abu Rafi shouted in pain and fury. And Abdullah approached him and struck him once more, but the blow was not fatal, and then plunged the sword into Abu Rafi's belly and left him bleeding. And he opened the doors one by one and came out. And the moon was out, but because of his bad vision, Abdullah missed his step and hurt his leg, and his turban wound around his leg. He sat down in the shadows by the gate, waiting until cockcrow, when a man intoned from atop the wall of the fortress said, I announce the death of Abu Rafi, the merchant of Hijaz. So the mission was over, and satisfied, Abdullah returned to his companions, safe in Medina again. They reported to the Prophet ﷺ, who saw Abdullah's bandaged leg and ran a hand over it and healed it. And it was a symbol of one more source of hurt had disappeared and one more enemy had been vanquished. Next is the chief Yamama is captured. Thumama bin Uthal was the chieftain of Yamama. His hatred of Islam and the Prophet ﷺ impelled him to make an attack on the Prophet ﷺ's life, and egged on by Musaylima the liar, who pretended to be a prophet and had his own reasons for wanting the Prophet ﷺ dead. Thumama set out in disgrace in Muharram, the 6th year after Hijrah, and his objective was to assassinate the Prophet, but he was captured by a party of Muslim horsemen who returned from a punitive expedition against Banu Bakr bin Kilab, and the Muslims under Muhammad bin Muslima took Thumama back to them to Medina, where they left him bound to a pillar in the Prophet ﷺ's mosque. So the Prophet ﷺ saw the captive and asked him, what do you expect, Thumama? And he said, I expect good, for if you kill me, you will kill one whose blood will be avenged, and if you show me favor, you will show it to one who is gracious, and if you want property, they will be given as much as you wish. So the Prophet ﷺ had left him there, and the following day the same question was asked with the same answer being given. On the third day, at the end of the same conversation, the Prophet ﷺ ordered Thumama released, and Thumama, it seems, had spent the 3 days in contemplation of issues more profound than the matter of his release. For upon being freed, he bathed and asked to be admitted into Islam. So later, he said to the Prophet ﷺ, I swear to Allah, O Muhammad, no face on the face of the earth was more abhorrent to me than yours, but now your face is the dearest of all to me. I also swear to Allah that no religion was more hateful to me than yours in the entire world, but now it is the dearest of all to me. And Thumama left Medina to perform Umrah in Mecca, where the Quraysh heaped vituperation on him for his change of heart, and Thumama's answer was swift. By Allah, not a grain of wheat will reach you from Thumama until the Prophet ﷺ permits. And Thumama spoke in earnest, and the Quraysh were left in despair, for not a single caravan was allowed to carry wheat to the Quraysh. And a letter was sent to the Prophet ﷺ asking for the embargo to be lifted, and only when he recommended selling grain to the Meccans did Thumama resume trade with them. And then last two more pages here, the expedition of Banu Lihyan. So in Usban, in the heart of Hijaz, lived Banu Lihyan, a tribe that had ambushed the 70 Muslims in Raja'i, and the memory of that tragic incident filled the Prophet ﷺ with the desire to punish Abu Lihyan, but he was forced to deal with several emergencies that demanded his attention. The Battle of the Trench was among them, and soon, however, the calm following the failed coalition gave him the opportunity to reclaim or to claim the retribution. So with an army of 200 men and 20 cavaliers, he marched upon the murderous Banu Lihyan in Rabi al-Awwal, the 6th year after the Hijrah, and the party reached Batan Gharan, a valley between Amaj and Usban, the site of the massacre. And there the Prophet ﷺ prayed for the martyrs and halted for 2 days. And when Banu Lihyan heard of the march against them, they took refuge in the hills and eluded capture. So the Prophet ﷺ went on to Usman with a squad of 10 cavaliers in the vanguard, and then moved up to Qara el-Ghamain And after 14 days, the Muslim forces returned then to Medina. And lastly, the final section before, I believe the final section. I'm sorry, two more sections here. Abdul As accepted Islam. So in Jamadi al-Awal, 60 after the Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ received news of a Qurayshi caravan returning from Syria and dispatched 170 cavaliers headed by Zayd bin Haritha to Is. And the caravan was led by Abdul As, the husband of Zainab, one of the Prophet ﷺ's four daughters. Husband and a wife had been estranged for 3 years since Zainab had migrated to Medina with her father after her husband refused to accept Islam. And the Muslims rounded up the entire caravan except for Abdul As, who fled to Medina and took shelter with Zainab. And he asked her to intervene and to request her father for the return of the caravan's cargo, and the Prophet ﷺ granted Zainab's request. Abdul As, known for his trading skills and his integrity, went back to Mecca, returned the goods to their rightful owners, and then embraced Islam. He then migrated to Medina, where he was reunited with Zainab. And since the verse forbidding marriage between unbelievers and Muslim women had not been revealed, the marriage was kept intact. And the Prophet ﷺ sent a number of cavalry units, Soraya, during this period, and they were significant in the fact that they quelled enemy uprising and established peace and order as far in far off areas. Lastly, here before we go ahead and close for today, in today's reading, before we reach page 200, is the expedition of Banu Mustalik or Moraisi. And so among the expeditions sent by the Prophet ﷺ, the one against Banu al-Mustalik in Shaban, 5th year or 6th year after the Hijrah, was a prominent event in Islamic history because a branch of the Banu Huza clan, which was on friendly terms with the Muslim Banu al-Mustalik, had sided with the Quraysh and were preparing for an attack on the Prophet ﷺ. And Barida bin Husayb was sent to gather intelligence and came back to Medina and confirmed the report. And once more, it was time for the Prophet ﷺ to leave Medina in the hands of another. Some say it was Zayd bin Haritha, and march out against the enemy. And with an army of 700 men, the Prophet ﷺ surprised Banu al-Mustalik, who were encamped at a spring named Morasi on the outskirts of Qudayd. And some of them were killed, their women and children were rounded up, and their property and livestock seized, and the operation had lasted for 2 nights. Actually, I meant to go to page, let me get here. But here, we'll stop here, inshallah, and we'll continue because we're a little bit past our time, inshallah, because I thought we were going to page 200. We still got technically 2 pages. You know what? What is it? Two more pages? You know what? Let's do it here. Let's do the 2 pages so we reach the place I wanted to finish for today, inshallah. Since we're all already here, Bismillah. So among the prisoners was Duwaria, the daughter of the wealthy Harith bin Durar. She accepted Islam in Medina, and the Prophet ﷺ set her free and then married her. And in defense of Duwaria, who gained the status of the mothers of the believers, and with her marriage to the Prophet ﷺ, 100 families from Banu al-Mustalik were set free. They had entered Islam, and the Prophet's companions released them, saying that they were the Prophet's relatives by marriage, and Duwaria had thus brought her people good fortune. And as expeditions go, the campaign against Banu al-Mustalik was noteworthy not because of its military importance, but because it gave rise to 2 extremely distressing and painful events which rent the Muslim community and the Prophet's heart. So when the Muslims were at the spring of Moraisi, a man from the Ansar clashed with the Muhajir, and the Ansari was beaten and called the other Ansar to his rescue, while the Muhajir called out to their Muhajirin. And the people who came up polarized themselves according to their place of origin, Mecca and Medina. And as the calls, O Ansar, O Muhajirin, rang out, the Prophet ﷺ recognized the ugly spirit of factionalism threatening the brotherhood of the Muslims, and he intervened immediately. I am still among you, he said. I hear calls from the days of ignorance. Ignore them, for they are foul. Contrarily, the two groups dispersed and returned to the path of brotherhood and unity. And meanwhile, a large number of men from the faction of the hypocrites were present on this expedition, as was their leader, Abdullah bin Ubay. And the incident at the spring was fodder for making mischief and nurturing resentment. He addressed the Ansar, stating, "How dare they, the Muhajirin, rise up against us? Here we are in our own country, and they have come in and tried to outnumber us. By God, it is just as the ancients said, feed the dog and it will bite you. I swear by God that when we return to Medina, the worthy and the noble ones will drive out the unworthy wretches." And by the worthy, he was referring to himself, of course, while the unworthy ones in the eyes who deserved to be driven out was the Prophet. So admonishing his men, he continued, "You yourselves have wrought this. You allowed them to settle in your country and shared your property with them. By God, had you held back and not been so generous, they would have surely gone elsewhere." So listening to Abdullah spew out his venom was a young companion of the Prophet, Zayd bin Arqam, who immediately brought the matter to the Prophet's attention. Abdullah bin Ubay was sent for and asked about his diatribe, and when he denied upon his oath, swearing the Prophet had been misinformed, and his glebe words saved him on that occasion. But the revelation of Sultan al-Munafiqun published this truth, and the name of Abdullah bin Ubay stands disgraced until the day of judgment. And ironically, Abdullah's son, who bore the same name as his father, was a true believer who had or incensed at his father's machinations, and he rushed to Medina ahead of the returning troops and stood there, barring his father's way. And as he faced his father, he said, "By Allah, until the Prophet ﷺ permits, you will not be allowed to advance another inch, for it is he who is honorable and you who are dishonorable." And the Prophet ﷺ told Abdullah to allow his father back into Medina, and a mortified Abdullah bin Ubay brooded over how to destroy the peace. And what had begun as a simple disagreement between two men at a spring had escalated into a rift, dividing an entire community and a father and a son. But this episode also showed that the only kinship of consequence is through righteousness and of faith. Alhamdulillah. So with that, for now, we'll stop here, inshallah. And the following week, we will continue at page 202, going into the famous act and reflection and revelation portion about the slander against Aisha, the mother of the believers. So with that, we'll go ahead and close. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi, ashhadu wa la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa